Remember, you guys are doing the submax lab for Friday. Make sure that you guys get all your calculations done. You guys get everything taken care of before you guys come to class. So we should be able to make lab run super quick on Friday for you guys, kind of talking through, then also understanding what are the repercussions for it. And since this lab is relatively easy and hopefully the weather's not going to be bad, do your best to show up to the 1:25 time if you can. And we can just all meet outside and kind of talk our way through our data, what it all means as we go through. You don't really need to see that. So now we've gone through our basic principles of training. So the first thing that we should do before we really work with anybody is just do a needs analysis, which is, okay, yeah, go ahead, Colleen, shoot when you're ready.
Okay, so my question doesn't like directly relate to this, but I guess it kind of does. So, okay, to like get the background to the question, yesterday I was like laying in my bed before I went to sleep, and then I like turned over really quick, and my heart just started beating really fast, like I had just exercised. Like, obviously, like turning over is not hard for me, like I like exercise and stuff, but I just want to know like why that is. Like, I want to know like why my body is like, it like reacts like that. Is it because I didn't move for a while and then just all of a sudden started to?
Honestly, that's a really hard one to give you a quick and simple answer to. It could be your heart rate kind of took off because you could have moved in such a way that effectively caused you to lose that parasympathetic tone for a second, which seems kind of odd to me, but I mean, stranger things happen. And where you had a quick little stress response for some reason, which obviously that's the sympathetic side. So you're dumping in that epinephrine, which is once again going to cause your heart rate also to increase. And obviously it could just be a combination of the two. Some folks will have those type of reactions just from changing their position a little bit. And that's can be due to some dysregulation of the nervous system. You could also be overtrained, which one of the ways that it's going to show itself sometimes is, yeah, that heart rate that's going to take off relatively rapidly, just because your body's in more of a stress, sympathetic tone more of the day than it should be instead of being that parasympathetic. So, interesting. Glad you're okay. Yeah, do not worry about the lab this week doing blood pressure. We're only going to deal with heart rate. The blood pressure is if we had you guys all in person and we were comfortable putting hands on each other. Because remember, you guys can just do the treadmill on your own. You're going to record your heart rate via either radial pulse or via, if you have like an Apple Watch or otherwise to give your heart rate. You are not going to use the walking like a zombie holding onto the handles for your heart rate. Otherwise, it really throws off your numbers. Now, obviously, you can have a partner helping you test through this, which is a way to make this a lot easier on you guys. But like anything else, we're trying to minimize our contacts as much as we can. Now, when you're doing your math and you're going through those submax stages, you should see the first stage when you figure out like the metabolic requirement is going to be somewhere in the teens. The second stage is going to be in the 20s, and the third stage is going to be into the 30s. So when you're going through doing your math, if you get numbers that are way above or below that, you probably didn't follow your order of operations or something else went kind of weird. So getting back to it, thinking about what our needs analysis are. So how are we going to move ourselves? What in turn are going to be the muscle groups we're going to be utilizing? What are the different types of training we probably need to use for this? What are the energy systems we're going to be using? And then where do we find the most high likelihood of injury? So our resistance training should be built up in such a way that we're dealing with all of the different needs we're incurring as we're going through whatever sport or activity we're trying to be successful with. So when it comes to lifting weights, we're going to have the concentric, so that's going to be the lifting component, and the eccentric, which is going to be the controlling it down, and isometric, where we're just holding position. So we're going to typically be stronger where we can do an eccentric followed by a concentric. So think about doing a squat or doing a bench press where you go down and then up, as opposed to just trying to pick up the bar from the very bottom. Now, when it comes to eccentric, this is going to be, once again, specific to the actions that we're trying to do. This is really useful because it means we can control our body when we're descending. This is a great way to help when we program this appropriately, decrease risk for things like ACLs and otherwise, because we're going to be very good at controlling our body and moving into the positions we need to, and not where we shouldn't be in the first place. Now, when we're writing a program, we want to go from our large muscle groups, compound movements, and high intensity, high power, high speed, then work our way into the smaller muscles, the single joint exercises, and the low intensity work. Meaning finish with your bicep curls, but start off with your power cleans, your snatches, etc. Then go into your things like your deadlifts, your squats, your presses, and then finish with, you know, the pumping up and, you know, spending a little time on the arm farm. Now, this rest period thing is absolutely hilarious to me, because this is obviously written by someone that isn't very strong. Your rest periods between sets is going to depend on your physical fitness levels and then how strong you are. Your strongest of your strongest land mammals, they can be taking somewhere between 5 minutes between each heavy set. Now, individuals that are smaller, not as strong and otherwise, we can be talking about only that 2 to 3 or the 1 to 2. It depends on what your goals are. If your goal is hypertrophy, you should probably be taking smaller rest periods. If your goal is maximal strength and power, we want to increase those rest periods. But like anything else, it's another variable we can modify depending on what we need. Now, static contractions, we're really just talking about isometrics, where we're just going to go pushing up against something and it's not going to go ahead and move. In theory, it was supposed to really help with performance, and it doesn't really seem to help too much, but it's really good when it comes to rehab situation, in that it's going to help people improve that neuromuscular coordination and remembering effectively how to fire their muscles appropriately in different positions in incredibly low risk positions or scenarios. Now, when it comes to the free weights versus machines, free weights is going to do a much better job of mimicking real life, because you have to go ahead and stabilize yourself as you're going through, and it's going to follow the strength curves of real life. Machines have an advantage when it comes to hypertrophy, because we can overload certain parts of the range of motion and in theory make them safer for the actual training. So our carryover, our specificity to life isn't as great. However, our ability to get more swole can be very useful. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with machines is we can go typically far lighter or far heavier, kind of like when we talked through the squatting example, when you guys were obviously in lab with me on Friday, and that if you're someone that squats a really heavy load, well, some folks, they might need to start on the leg press, because just doing a body weight squat might be a little beyond the strength of their abilities if they're, you know, particularly very heavy with not a lot of muscle tone. So they both have a purpose. The key is the time and the place. If you only have access to one, free weights is going to be your best option, because once again, that has the best carryover to real life. If your goal is to just be really pretty, yeah, hang out on the machines, who cares? But at the end of the day, just being mindful of, once again, there's advantages and disadvantages. And remember biomechanics, guys. Remember our effort arm and our resistance arm, and then also seeing as we go through the ranges of motion, we're going to hit differing amounts of essentially resistance we have to overcome. Now, dynamic eccentric training, we're really talking about doing things where we're going to go ahead and really lower heavy loads, and trying to move effectively really quickly with them in certain conditions. Because remember, we're stronger lowering than we are lifting. In theory, it can increase strength gains. I'll tell you from the research that I've seen, it also has really high risks of injuries. So if you're going to do eccentric style training, just be safe. Specifically, I'm referring to like you put 100% of your back squat max on the bar and you just focus on lowering it down. Actually, sometimes we'll go like 105, 110% and go really slow lowering it. And then, you know, do other training on top. It's a lot of loads. So you have to be very, very careful there. Now, concentric is going to be the more important part whenever it comes to just strength. Eccentric seems to be where it's really important for our muscle hypertrophy. So you do want to have somewhat control of the load when you're going down. Now, when we talked about machines, they give us variable resistance, which means thanks to the cam, so literally the leverage of the arm as we're lifting it is going to cause the load to actually be received in slightly higher amounts and lower amounts, depending on where we're at in the range of motion. This allows us to effectively work our muscles in a way that we're really at the top where most people barely fail on things like squats and deadlifts, we can make the load even heavier. Using accommodating resistance is another form of this, like when you're using something like bands and chains. Now, we then have isokinetic training, and this is going to be whenever we're doing work where we're working against a constant velocity. Once again, this is used in rehab settings. This can be potentially useful, but it's rarely something you're going to get a lot of access to. Kaiser machines utilize this. That's a true isotonic as opposed to real lifting is isoinertial, but we don't need to get into that type of thing. With isokinetic, no matter how hard you push, you're only going to be moving at a certain speed. And this can potentially be useful, but it's very rare to see, and this is mostly used in rehab settings. Now, plyometrics, we're talking about jumping up to objects, we're talking about throwing objects. This is a great way to utilize that stretch shortening cycle, so we're improving our muscle spindle function. We are causing our GTOs to be a little less sensitive and can obviously have some pretty positive effects on getting us to use those type 2 fibers. So this is a great thing to add in conjunction to your resistance training as a means to have even greater carryover to your sport of interest. And then trying to find movements that are going to be somewhat mimicking what you're trying to do when it comes to that sport. So, for example, when it comes to throwing a baseball, throwing a softball, you don't necessarily want to get a heavier med ball and try to throw that, or a heavier baseball. That is a way that you could potentially hurt your arm, specifically your rotator cuff and otherwise. However, you can take a medicine ball and do a put. So you're concentrating on getting that rotational power through your core along with your legs as a means to obviously add on to the type of velocity you're going to be able to get from throwing the object with your shoulder in the first place. So there's a lot of different plyometric options you can use. I'm sure the cross-country kids at some point have had to do bounds, single leg bounds, as a way to help increase their performance. Obviously, other sports like volleyball and otherwise, that's a lot of the sport is doing plyometrics, doing step approach jumps and doing maximal jumps. But even then, you'll still see incorporation to things like box jumps and otherwise, depending on where they're at with the season. Now, if you really want to know pain, you can always use electrical stim. Now, this is literally hooking yourself up to actually a wonderful electrode that in turn is going to be firing on your nerve, which in turn makes your muscle contract whether or not you want to or not. Now, this is once again something used often because people are coming back from surgery. This is something that can work. And let me tell you, if they're putting enough current through you to get your muscles to contract, it does not feel good. Yeah, it is not something that I would sign up for a training protocol, specifically if you had to do enough to really enhance maximal strength in someone who's already well trained. So electrostim is not a great thing to use for long-term training gains. Now, core stability is something that it's not just our abs, it's also going to be the muscles of our hips and then our erectors on the backside of the body. So if we're looking at the skeleton of the body, yes, I have not just heard of Russian stim, but I have done Russian stim, Courtney. It feels like you've hooked yourself up to a car battery and you are causing fused tetanus in whatever muscle you're trying to train. And it is incredibly uncomfortable and painful. Now, a lot of athletes intuitively are going to be able to stabilize their core whenever they're cued to do so. Sometimes you have to give them this information. The problem is we have got this nice, thick, bony pelvis, and then we've got this nice lattice work of ribs to protect our upper back. And then in between, we have a slinky. So it's going to be your muscles here that are stabilizing your torso when you're doing heavy lifting. So like anything else, the better job we do of stabilizing through here, the better job we're going to be effectively getting the force that's going through our leg to travel all the way through to our hand. Now, when we're losing this force because we can't stabilize, this is what's known as a force leakage. We do want to make sure that our athletes have not just a strong enough core, but strong enough stabilizers everywhere throughout the body so that they're going to be able to fully manifest their body's ability to produce force. And that requires using a trained eye of figuring out, okay, where are they having to compensate? Where are they having issues with their movement that we're going to be able to enhance their performance and keep them safer? So this is definitely something that can help decrease the risk of injury. It's going to cause our muscle spindles to go ahead and contract So we're not going to allow ourselves to flex over as much. And one thing is when we're typically working with our core fibers, they're typically very type 1, meaning we need to use a lot of sets of high reps to really get into them, to really cause a great deal of training effect and performance. Now, when we're thinking about our anaerobic and aerobic powertrain, we want to use as sport-specific of metabolic systems as we can so that we're going to be able to perform well at the sport. But there's a big caveat to this, okay? So, yeah, actually, if you don't mind, can you unmute yourself, Sydney?
Yeah.
How energetically demanding is one of your actual volleyball matches? So one of the games you're playing against another team compared to your practices?
I think like in practices where it's like more fast paced and in the game it's slower. So like in the games we have more time to cheer.
Yeah.
And like it's more energy, but I would say we're exerting more energy in practices than we would be in a game.
Yeah. So, and thank you. That's exactly my point there, which is when it comes to the sport specific metabolic systems, with cross country, it makes perfect sense. They're going to train the same energy system that they're competing all the time. However, when you're looking at sports like football, volleyball, baseball, softball, a lot of their practice is going to be a lot higher tempo, a lot shorter rest than their actual games are going to be. So make sure that we're not just training our athlete for their sport, but we're also training them in such a way that they can survive their practice. So, like anything else, we're going to be thinking of it as long as a continuum. We're going to have sprints. We're really talking about that ATP PCR, our long sprints, middle distance. So really going up and down the length of a typical baseball, would be football, soccer field. And then our straight up long distance, where you're going to be going incredibly long periods of time. And obviously the velocity goes down as the energy system becomes more and more aerobic. So we have to be ready for these things dynamically. For our cross country kids, they live here. For our shot putters, they live here. However, for our soccer players, they live a little bit in each of these, mostly here, but then they're going to spend a decent amount of time in each of these depending on their role, and we need to make sure they're prepared for it. So what we have here is the ACSM's basic idea of what percents and what reps you're going to be working in order to get effects on strength, hypertrophy, power, and endurance. And it's not bad. Parts of it are garbage, but that's okay because you are not using up to 100% of your max to build hypertrophy. That's just straight up Fruit Loops and wrong. You're going to be typically talking more like 60 to 80% because you just simply can't do that many reps. In fact, yeah, I would love to see who's going to be able to bang out 12 reps at 100% of their max, or much less even 12 reps at 70% of your max is not going to be an easy day. So this is not a bad place to kind of start and think about where we're going to build up from. However, it is important. Exactly. If you can do 100% for more than one, it's not your 100%. Absolutely, Randall. So what I like instead is going to be these two basic essential figure and then a table for you guys. This figure gives you a good idea of given the number of reps you're doing, and this is the reps that are like you could only do 10, you could only do 12, you could only do 5, of what you're emphasizing the most. So if you guys go in the gym and you're effectively just banging out a bunch of, you can only do sets of 10, like that was it. Well, we're mostly building hypertrophy. However, we're still having a little bit of effect on increasing our maximal strength and power along with our muscular endurance. Now, if our goal is to just build maximal strength, now we're talking, guys, as you can see, 5 or less reps per set. We're talking obviously what's going to be very, very heavy loads. And we're not really getting much of a hypertrophy effect, much less a muscular endurance effect. And this is from the NSCA Essential Strength Conditioning text, which I personally am a bigger fan of. Now, if our goal is to just get great muscular endurance, notice, guys, who cares about that department meeting, that you're going to be doing much, much higher reps. And obviously, our emphasis on strength, power, and hypertrophy are in turn going to be going down. So this is just something to kind of give you guys an idea of what we're looking at on a per set basis. Now, then what we have is going to be what's known as the Prilipin chart. So AS Prilipin was a statistician that sat down and looked through all of these successful Olympic lifters and figure out how many reps per set would these athletes do at different percentages of their max that would give them a total range of this many training reps per training session. And then what was the optimal number of sets times reps at different percentage ranges for their overall training session. So what the heck does this mean? Well, effectively, notice if we're trying to, these are Olympic lifters, so we're trying to think mostly this is a power style athlete. You see the high-end sets were only for 6 reps, and that was only up to 80%. Then we're talking sets of 4, and once we're over 90, we're only doing doubles. Mind you, at 90%, most people can only really handle 3 reps, occasionally 4. So the total number of sets times reps. So let's say you went into the gym, you put 75% of your, you want 75% of your max in whatever movement you want to do. You're going to go in there and do 3 sets of 6 reps. Congratulations, you've done the 18 reps. You are now in the center of the optimal training range, so the optimal dosage of training effect for that day. So this is just kind of a good way if you guys are really trying to be a strength and power style trainee of really how much work do we want to do in certain ranges, and they're all going to add up. Now, this might not be making a lot of sense right now. When we're giving anybody training, we're trying to give them a specific dosage to try to make them better. Figure that we have our initial starting point, and then this is going to be, you know, good old, we'll call that time, okay? This is going to be our performance, obviously going up or down in either direction. So we want to find the point of which we hit our peak stimulus and then, oh crap, okay? Meaning, right around here is where we've done that optimal number of total training reps. We've made the greatest amount of progress from that one workout we're going to make in that given day, okay? So this right here is that volume, okay? So the minimal side that you guys saw a moment ago is probably going to have us kicked over somewhere in this range where it's like, okay, we're not making maximal progress, but we're at least going to be making some progress or at least maintaining our performance. Now over here is getting to that upper end of the range. Like, okay, we're doing a lot more work. It might not be giving us as much forward progress, but we're definitely still getting a return on investment. Now, what we don't even bother putting out there is what is the point of work that you've done so much damage to yourself that your body is going to barely be able to claw you back to where you started. And now you're really tired and you maybe, but you didn't hurt yourself. You just did a lot of work that literally got you nowhere. So kind of like people walking on treadmills with a wreck where they are both literally and metaphorically going nowhere. No, I'm kidding. That's only if they're taking a lot of calories, they're working low rate. And now what do you think is occurring when we get down over here, guys? What do you think this is? Yeah. Well, diminishing returns was already once we passed this point, Randall. Yeah, we're going not just into fatigue or exhaustion, but now we're talking about possibly hurting ourselves. So how many of you guys have got a friend, a teammate, anybody that went into the gym and just completely demolished themselves? They did so much work that they were not just wrecked from that training session, but they weren't even recovered from that training session well over a week afterwards. Like, congratulations, you beat the living crap out of yourself and you made absolutely no forward progress. Like, that just sounds awful to do a bunch of work that literally gets you nowhere. Does that make sense to you guys? Why we care about that Prilipin chart? Awesome. So a good way to do aerobic style training is going to be what's known as intervals. So we're going to go ahead and do a certain amount of work, give a bit of a recovery or a lower intensity work that we're going to have them recover with, and then go ahead and have them work at a higher intensity work against a greater or a lower intensity or just relatively no effort to recover and then repeat. I'm sure a lot of you guys have done this exact thing. I'm quite sure cross-country kids know it way too well, but it's a nice, easy way to go ahead and get in some good training effects. Now, this is great for just about anything. Now, we have to keep in mind when we have a sport, we need to figure out our mode, and then from there we can adjust. So how long our exercise interval is going to be is going to depend on our sport, the distance as well, the number of reps per training session, what type of form of active rest, and the type of activity we want them to be doing during that active recovery, and then frequency per week. Now we're getting down to dosage. So we're going to divide you guys into 4 groups. Okay. You guys are going to run through these basic ideas. Okay. Group 1 has what is going to be a soccer midfielder. Okay. Group 2 is going to go ahead and have, which was fun. We're going to say a hockey forward. Group 3 is going to go ahead and be working with what would be something fun that has a lot of requirement. You know, we're going to say a basketball point guard. And then finally, our group 4. Anybody have any ideas that they'd like to do? We're going to go with a volleyball libero, which is a defensive specialist for those of you guys that aren't familiar. You have the power of the internet, use it in your favor. But, okay, what's going to be the rate of that interval? What's going to be the distance, number of sets, reps, etc. And when you guys get back, I'm also going to go ahead and talk through a little bit of how we'd apply that to water polo. So we're going to have 4 different groups. It's going to be random. Have a good time with your teammates, guys. It's 1:53, 1:54 now. We're going to come back at 2 o'clock. So get after it in the chat. Okay, not a bad idea of picking a modality that's going to require running up and down the field or the court in your guys' specific example, and you're picking something that is specific to the size, which is it's basketball players, so they will be running up and down the court. Now, notice everything you're doing is just running straight forward, though. Are they going to have to shuffle the side? Are they going to have to backpedal? So we might want to incorporate something along those lines, too. Number of sets, 4 sets of 2 with 1 minute break in between. Whew. And I guess there's going to be an inter rep rest as well. So that amount of volume is going to be something that's going to be slightly mimicking, depending on how much that point guard is going to get as far as game time. Might not be a bad setup. So good work there, guys. Good work. What else do we got? We got 3 other groups. Whenever you guys are ready.
So in group 4, we thought that we could do we talked about doing 10 to 20 meter sprints and any type of agility work in between those. And the sprints could be 10 seconds with like a 45 second break. And then you would want to do at least 10 to 20 of those like 3 times a week. And like incorporating any type of like agility, shuffling things with like where you have to cut would also be good. And I feel like the rest time, nothing over a minute, but you wouldn't necessarily need to be doing something that requires you to just keep going nonstop.
Yeah, because obviously, yeah, the active recovery can definitely be something along the lines of walking or standing there, since that's a lot more mimicking what's going on in the sport. So no, that's good work there, Sid. Okay, Evan's group. Not bad, because yeah, it's gonna be effectively a lot of jogging with a bit of running / sprinting involved, and then some walking at the lowest for recovery, or very slow jogging. So kind of doing tempo style runs or interval runs on the field, that would be a great choice. Great job, Randall and Randall's group, for realizing the shift change part of hockey. So hence you can do a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. Whereas obviously things like basketball and soccer, you're going to keep going the entire time. And not that volleyball obviously doesn't have a lot of work as well. So you just got to be able to get them to be kind of an anaerobic monster with enough aerobic to survive for that 3 to 4 minutes, and then recover, and repeat, and then make sure there's enough volume there. Absolutely. So if I was to apply the same thing only when it comes to the sport of water polo, so the rate of the exercise interval would be essentially 80% of the maximal swim speed. Distance of this exercise would probably be about, I would probably have them do about 15 to 20 meters. And they would be essentially swimming down at that high rate and pausing for a little bit, swimming back. It's, it's 10 or 7.5 minutes quarters for water polo. So we'd obviously try to figure they're going to be doing, it's probably 10 to 20 reps. And then their active rest recovery is going to be treading water for probably 15 to 20 seconds before they go ahead and effectively move their way back. And that's at 20 to 30 seconds. The frequency per week, same thing, probably start off with 2, maybe work your way up to 3 to 4 times. And then also keep in mind that practicing the sport at some point is probably going to be an adequate amount of conditioning for a lot of sports, not all of them. So other sports, maybe you got to do some extra conditioning on the side because they're not doing it. But that's relatively rare. So instead, we need to make sure that once again, we're giving them enough work, we're giving them enough of effectively a stimulus that the body has to maintain, if not increase their performance. So there's a lot of different ways that we can go ahead and look at exercise intensity. An easy way is just look at percentage of our heart rate max. We can also look at something like percentage of heart rate reserve and or MET equivalents and otherwise, but they're just all different mathematical ways of trying to figure out what percentage you're working at. Now, obviously, the higher the intensity, the more, anaerobic energy systems we're having to rely upon. And when we're in our aerobic oxidative training sets, really trying to enhance that performance, we're talking 75 to 85% of our max, but we're still getting some positive effects on our aerobic system anytime we're effectively over what's going to be an easy way to say like 100 beats per minute, but an easier way to think of it would be at least over half of your heart rate max. And specifically when we get over at least 60% of our heart rate max, remember that's where we're getting some major contributions from increasing our stroke volume. So you're still having a positive effect on your heart and probably also on your blood, whereas the positive effect on your capillaries, that's going to require a bit more intensity. And that's obviously specific to the muscles we're using. Hence why it's so important that we pick both the active our exercise modality and our recovery mode to be mimicking things that they're actually going to be using in that sport. So we're looking at percent heart rate max. All we're going to do is take your max heart rate, minus your resting heart rate. And that's going to give us a numerical value. And then we're going to, we just take your heart rate that you're currently at, divide it by your max heart rate. Boom. Heart rate reserve is where you take that spread between the two and figure that out. So once again, decent indicator of figuring out, okay, how hard are we really working out? And that's where heart rate monitors are a great thing that we can wear. And obviously now there's a lot more wrist mounted options where we can get an idea of how hard is somebody working, and does it seem that it's going to be in a big enough intensity or otherwise to really require them to make those changes and to improve at that given endeavor. So what we have here, guys, is going to be our lactate response depending on our exercise intensity and our distance we're having them go at. So obviously the 200 meters, we can get a much greater accumulation. Whereas as we go for the 400 meters, so 1 full lap and then 2 laps, notice lactate accumulation isn't high because you can't maintain those outputs with those massive amounts of lactate being produced. And specifically, is notice how the rest periods would go down. So there's how much can you also recover from at the same time, even though effectively, yeah, their distances are going to be somewhat similar. There's going to be much different intensities of what we're doing. So how many reps and sets we're doing is going to come down to what's the sport. So if we're doing something like baseball, softball, or volleyball, we're talking about relatively short, very intense intervals. We got to move quickly. We have to be powerful. Whereas then if we look at something like soccer, okay, we want to have much longer intervals because we got to be covering some ground, going down the field back and forth, and even more so, obviously, when we're talking about the sports of cross country, triathlon, and so on. So now also what we're going to be influenced by is effectively how long we're going to rest for. Now, an easy way to do this is actually base this off of heart rate itself. So once your heart rate gets down to a certain level, okay, now once we get under that certain heart rate, it's time to go again. However, another way that we can do this is think about with our active recovery, we're waiting until that heart rate goes below. And now this is a great thing. If we all lined up on a field and did a sprint down all the way across it, we would have differing probably max heart rates. But what we could do to program our rest intervals so that everyone's getting a pretty good aerobic component is as soon as your heart rate gets under 120 beats, you've got to run back. And so by having that type of active recovery, people that are not in very good condition might be standing down at one end of the field for quite some time before their heart rate comes down low enough they get to do another sprint. Whereas people that are in really good aerobic shape, they might be having to feel like they're stop for a second, sprint back, stop for a second, sprint back, and stop for a second. But based upon heart rate, they will be recovered. So they're actually going to be more comfortable. And now we're training people according to the actual level of fitness they're walking into it. And I'm sure all of you guys at some point when playing team sports and having to condition as a team, you became acutely aware of differing physical fitness levels amongst your teammates by who would finish at what speeds and who would be sucking wind far longer than others, simply because, once again, different levels of physical fitness. So the higher the exercise intensity we're doing, we probably want to have a lower recovery intensity. And as we get to be in better condition, we can not just deal with greater intensities, but we're going to be able to recover faster. So we can be talking about a walk to a jog on land, and then with swimming, like it says, it's slow swimming or just hanging onto the side. And once again, if you do water polo, because it's typically done in an all deep pool, you get to tread water, and it is, you get used to it. It just becomes something you have to do or you drown. Now, how frequently we're going to train is going to really come down to what level do we need to get somebody up to. So if you're just talking about just general overall health and wellness, we're probably talking 2 to 4 sessions, but we should be doing some type of basic walking around, moving our bodies every single day of the week. Now, if you're trying to look at somebody that's like a really high level athlete, we could be talking about multiple training sessions per day. So we can be literally doing some type of form of conditioning, possibly for what would end up being 13 or more workouts. So like anything else, it depends on who we're working with, how well trained they are, and what's that stimulus that we need in order to keep them to be moving forward and performing better. So now then we have the good old continuous training. So this is going to be that long, slow distance. Is that going out for that incredibly far runs or long periods of time of movement where our goal is just to keep going the entire time. We are going to have obviously a pretty decent intensity If we're training for something like a marathon or a half marathon, that intensity is going to be lower. If we're using that LSD as a means to get better with our aerobic base, when it comes to things like a 5K, 8K, 10K, we're going to be going at a bit higher of intensity. But like anything else, this is spending a lot of time just keeping up that output. So we want to have that heart rate within a certain range. It tends to be a pretty safe way to train and relatively popular. But like anything else, we need to focus on covering that distance, spending that time of getting used to doing all of that work. Now, this is doing a lot more damage to our muscles and joints, which can lead itself to greater overuse injuries simply because we're doing so many more reps. But like anything else, this is a good training modality when you just need to be in better aerobic condition. Now, a fartlek is not the same as interval, but what we're now looking at is we're going to use a variety of different speeds. So we sprint a distance, jog a distance, walk a distance, and then sprint again, and kind of do those 3 different options. So we feel like we're constantly doing something done a little bit differently. Hill repeats is something you're going to see a lot in cross country or some of the distance athletes, because it just gives you something different than just, handcuffing yourself to a treadmill and then regretting life. Also, guys, fun fact, treadmills were originally medieval torture devices for where people would essentially walk on the tread to move the mills, which would mill flour. So which people literally go to a gym to walk on was literally medieval torture. That's where we're at now as a culture. Not going to read into that too far. Okay. And then obviously just doing those good old intervals. So going for a certain distance, and then we can maybe have some bodyweight calisthenics, do some push-ups, sit-ups, or otherwise, run back and forth. This is a great way to go ahead and train an athlete and then give them a lot of different options. You'll see certain parks. I found one actually in Lexington the other weekend at a very low intensity stations. There's actually 2 of them that I've come across, where they'll have like a station where you're supposed to do push-ups, a station where you're supposed to do sit-ups, and you just kind of go back and forth doing whatever option you want. But like anything else, it's going to be a good way to train the whole body. So there's a little bit of a resistance training component while we're doing the aerobic. Yes, you do not stop when you guys are doing your submax VO2 lab on Friday. You do not stop. You keep walking and taking your pulse while you're walking on the treadmill during each of those stages. Do not stop. You have to stay moving. If you stop, your numbers will not work. That is a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. So, yes, take it while you're moving, which is going to make it a lot more challenging. That's why, like I said, a lot of people are going to be tempted to do the zombie walk. You can't do that. It's going to mess up your results because it makes it easier to walk on the treadmill, which in turn is going to have your heart rate go lower, which is once again going to mess with your results. So you have to take your heart rate while you're moving. So either try to thoroughly clean someone's borrowed Apple Watch and use that to have your heart rate for those different stages or different times between each of those stages, or instead go and just take your radial pulse, make sure you can find it, and have a pen and paper ready so you can write it down as you're going through each stage, or use your phones to save the information. Any other questions you guys have for me? Otherwise, that's all we've got for today. And yeah, keep those head above water and keep working hard, guys. Yes. You can do it twice for extra credit by wearing different masks. So either if you've got like an N95 and a normal, so do it once with the N95, do it once with the normal, give yourself a little cool down between each, or you can go and just like double mask it, something where it's going to make things a little bit more difficult so we can compare the differences between the two. Way to be on the ball today, Randall. Good work there, bud. Yes, make sure you take that quiz if you haven't already. Another good call. So, any other questions, comments, concerns? Stay safe out there, guys. Have a great day. I'll see you guys for lab on Friday. Remember, try to come to the first lab if possible. Bye-bye.